I need a wee, I need a wee, I need a wee, I need a wee. If only I had a Stormcast portaloo. Wait a minute. You mean the Stormreach portal? That's not a portaloo, isn't it? Oops. Hi everybody, welcome back. I'm Wayne. I'm going to paint the Stormreach portal. This was something that I had no intentions of buying. A friend of mine hates it, absolutely despises this model. And I can see why. It's a bit of a brick. Hello, Future Editing Wayne here. This is going to be a longer video than I originally planned. Sorry about that. So you might want to get yourself a cup of tea or a drink of some sort if you're going to watch this entire thing. Yeah, it's about half an hour long. Sorry about that. But let me know if you like longer form content like this that goes into it in a little bit more depth, a little bit more detail. I'm more than happy to do that. It's actually way more fun to produce, to be totally honest. Let me know down in the comments. Okay, I'll leave you back to it. I think I can make it look a little bit more interesting than the Games Workshop paint scheme. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Tying it in to our Stormcast paint scheme we did a while back. Link up here if you've not seen those videos. We did some Grimdark Stormcast of the Reclusian Chamber. Or maybe we'll just make it look like a really pretty portaloo. I don't know. Let's find out. This particular model has been something that has caused mixed feelings in the community. It's the Stormreach portal. I don't think it's as bad as everybody says, but let's see what we can do. I want this to fit in with the theme that we've did. If you've not already seen the previous videos where I did my take on the Grimdark Stormcast, jump back and have a look at those. I'll put them up there or up there. I can't remember which side it's going to be on. And have a look at how we painted them. In short, they were a gold fading to a gunmetal silver with purple highlights here and there. They're a little bit more battered, a little bit more worn to reflect the fact that they were from the Reclusian Chamber. And that's kind of the feel I want to go with this. I'm going to put this on a small base. There's a couple of reasons for doing that. It's going to give us a little bit more space to work with. I try and paint as many things as possible in sub-assemblies where required because it makes it a little bit easier. So in this case, we've got this top part as one sub-assembler. We've got this main brick as another sub-assembler, and we've got the base as the third and final sub-assembler. Now, I could keep these two together. The reason I am doing this as two sub-assemblers is this portal part is going to be a glow, and I want that to be nice and easy to paint. So putting this on the base will make the bottom part a little bit harder to get to, and thus keeping them separate is going to help us further down the line. How big you want to do the base doesn't really matter. I'm sure there are some gaming implications there, but for me, I'm just going to make it slightly bigger than the perimeter of the base and glue it straight down to it. Put a little bit of texture paste so it looks like it's actually part of that base. And then once we've done all of the painting, we'll use some of the purple flowers we used again on the Stormcast. Don't forget to check out those other videos to tie it back into the overall army theme. Let's get that done, and then we can start talking about paint schemes, because I'm not 100% yet, so it's going to give me some time to think. Let's get on with it. Getting this built into sub-assemblies then is exactly where I started, and putting the base down onto some plasticard. Just using a sheet of 2mm plasticard, I basically drew around the base, glued it on, and then cut it out using a scalpel into a shape that looked somewhat organic. Covered it with some glue, put some sanding base texture on there of different sizes and grains, adding some rocks around the perimeter, and I just primed then the entire model black, keeping it in those three sub-assemblies. And all we're going to do is to start off then is come in with the airbrush or some rattle can if you prefer, but I would use the airbrush and it keeps it nice and focused. And I'm just going to start picking out areas of interest on the model that I want to come back to later and have any specific elements glowing. As we always do, laying the foundations is critically important here. You'll have noticed on the previous Stormcast tutorial videos that I did that laying those foundations for the OSL later on do help with this entire process, so trust that process. Now, that said, we're not just going to use OSL here, and I am going to pay some attention to the rest of the model. It's going to be a fairly easy paint job, but what I want to do is to start laying down values, giving myself places that I know I'm going to have a tonal difference. So a couple of different greys perhaps on the steps or around the base to make it look a little bit more natural with varying browns, and I'll be coming back in with washes later on. Let's carry on with what we've just done then and work on the portal. Now, we would normally do this at the end of the painting process if we were following the same structure as we did with the actual Stormcast themselves. But in this case, we're going to do it the other way around. We're going to start laying those foundations now because we know exactly where this really large area of OSL is going to be, and we want to have that effect as the dominant focal point of this model. So getting this in early is going to give us the opportunity to really dial back the vibrancy and the saturation of some of the other colors, which again is going to make this even more vibrant, which is exactly what I want for this piece of terrain. I want it to be a focal point of the army and really dominant on the battlefield when I eventually field it. So much like we have done in previous tutorials where we've been looking at OSL, I'm going to come in with a thin down ink through my airbrush, and I'm just going to start to lay light coats down where I want the hottest, brightest parts of the model to be. Now this is going to be the part that's emitting the light. So thinking in terms of contrast, if we've got white, that is going to be the brightest, the hottest part. To make that really pop, we want areas of darkness, and it's that contrast, as we've discussed many times now, that sells the effect. You'll notice how I'm keeping the orientation of the airbrush quite static and actually moving the piece to get those different angles to allow parts of the model to mask other parts of the model. Understanding this technique is really going to help you get the natural shadows that are cast by the model, and this really helps in selling the effect. It also makes things just a little bit easier. It's lazy and, well, efficient, and I'm all about that. Great, we're done with this initial step then of laying down those white values so we know where the glow is going to be cast from, and we've set up ourselves for a decent gradation in color. Now let's start getting some of those other colors on here, and I'm going to start off with metallics. A gold, a silver, and a gunmetal. And we're going to use these to create a gradient from gold at the top all the way down to the gunmetal at the bottom, and this is going to replicate that theme that we saw on the Stormcast themselves. Again, I'm going to do this through an airbrush, but you could do it with a rattle can. You could mask the areas off if you want, but if you're steady enough with your airbrush, you should be all right. Starting off with the gold, I'm going to work my way around the model, targeting each of the panels where I want this gradient to start. Now, you could do the entire top part of the model and then paint other details in later that we don't want to be metallic, but I want to utilize that black undercoat that we've already established. One question that often pops up in the comments when you see me using airbrushes in projects like this is what airbrush I'm using and what settings on my compressor and how thin are my paints. Now, all of these things are completely subjective. I try to steer away from telling you specific pressures and specific formulations of paints because, well, it totally depends on your own setup. Even using exactly the same compressor and the same airbrush and the same needle tip and all of these other things, changes in temperature, fluctuations in all kinds of variables will change your... The biggest advice I can give to anybody starting out with an airbrush is to persevere. You've got to put in the effort and time to learn your setup and to really build up that skill set. There isn't no magic bullet, there isn't any shortcuts. You've just got to practice, really, much like you do with a paintbrush. It's a skill that's acquired over time, and your neatness and your ability to use your equipment will only increase as you use it more. So do stick with it. Don't look for these magic solutions, formulations for whatever it is. Just have fun doing it. Over time, you'll certainly increase and start to get to a level of proficiency with your equipment that you are happy with, but you've got to put in those reps. Okay, so what we're doing now is I'm just starting to paint in some of the details of the roof that I want to be gold as well. Now, I'm not being too fussed about the overspray here, but with hindsight, I would have been perhaps a little bit more careful. It does come back to bite me in the bottom further down the line, but it is what it is. If you do end up overspraying like I have here, I would strongly recommend you going back in with black and a paintbrush and just tidying that up. It gives it that more grimdark aesthetic rather than the transparency of acrylic paint negatively impacting the overall finish of the model. Finished with the gold, let's crack on with the silver. Now, I've taken the liberty of just laying down some bright silver right underneath the gold, again with the airbrush. This is nothing that you need to follow along one-to-one with, and I'm going to come back in with that gunmetal again, significantly thinned down, and I'm going to start laying on that bottom layer. So we've gone from gold, we've gone to silver, and now we're on the gunmetal, and we're using exactly the same technique. You'll notice here that I'm using a 45-degree, almost zenithal-like angle, and that's just to maintain the darkness of the primer in the shadows. I've chosen to do the 6 panels on the external of the portal in this metallic, giving it that gradient, contrary to how I normally work, which is having an exact plan of what I'm going to do and how I'm going to achieve the finish that I want. And this, I winged it somewhat. And well, I tell you what, let me know down in the comments if you can see the changes that I make as we're going through the video, where I've made any mess ups. Now we've got the metallic sorted, let's crack on with getting some of the colours down. I'm going to use somber grey. So it's quite a warm grey. There's definitely a hint of red in there. And we're going to use this to basically base everything that I want to be stone looking. So in the first instance, the columns, everything that we've not done metallic. So these bottom parts, all of the columns, and yeah, I am using the airbrush for this. I'm pretty much going to use the airbrush for this entire project. So if you're not confident in being pretty accurate with your airbrush, perhaps come in with a brush. But if you are confident with where you're spraying with your airbrush, then just for expediency, I'm going to use my airbrush. So very carefully, all the way around, I'm hitting the columns, the bottom part of the stone, and then we're going to jump to the base as well, getting the steps in and the plinth, pedestal, whatever it is that this thing's sat on, giving a nice, strong base color to it. Now, it looks a little bit stark at the moment. It looks like there's not enough contrast, enough detail in there, but don't worry, we're going to sort that out. It didn't take me too long to work all the way around the base here, and I'm not worried about too much overspray on the rocks as well. It's just going to add some diversity when we come back in with another color. Speaking of which, let's get on with that. The next color is going to be a sepia ink, undiluted straight through the airbrush, and I'm just going to start laying down a couple of light spritzes here and there in the shadows. Now, you'll notice that I'm keeping the actual Stormreach portal on top of the pedestal here. The reason for that is any overspray is going to look like dust and detritus settling on the bottom of the model, and it's going to stop us with those micro oversprays that we've got, giving it any type of disparity between the colors. Now, you'll see I'm going quite heavy in some places, quite light in other. Now, that is because I want to have some variation, and this is one of the things that is really great about the airbrush. And quite subtle variations or quite stark, obvious variations is really simple with just the simplest change in trigger pressure. As you can see here as well, as I mentioned, having the portal on top of the pedestal is really helping establish a connection between the base and the pedestal here. Yes, it means that when I come to glue it down, I've got to be very careful that I get it the right way around. However, this really does help tie the two elements, the base and the model together. And that's something that I've tried to carry over as well into the actual general army painting process. Often it's easy to do the base as a separate element, and then there is no consistency between the base and the model. This is one of those processes that really helps that. So working his way all around, picking different angles, just where you might think it would look good. There isn't any real formula to this. I'm not going for hyper-realism or anything like that. I'm just going for rule of cool, what looks good to my eye, maybe different for you. Just enjoy the process. That's the main thing that you should take away. It's got to be fun. If it's not, then it's not a hobby, is it? It's work. I've still got that sepia in my airbrush. What I'm going to do then is take the portal off, and I'm going to start laying down some shadows and giving a little bit of variation and interest to the rest of the model. With metallics, it's important to sell them in a natural way, and I like something that looks a little bit more contrasty, I think. Even though it has a somewhat natural feel, re-establishing shadows really does make them pop. So as you can see here, I'm just coming in from the underside, paying particular attentions to the gold, but also at the bottom of the model where it's a little bit darker naturally, where it intersects with the base, and on the underside of all of the columns. Now, using a color like this sepia, almost like a wash if you were using the standard base shade layer system, it's going to help bring out the detail. So before, when we said just laying down the greys, it looks a little bit stark. This is bringing back some more visual interest, some variation in tone, catching certain elements, certain details without being too deliberate. Now, yes, there is an inconsistency there, but it's the inconsistencies that make things look natural. If things look too uniform, then, well, they look unnatural, uninteresting to the eye. You just go from one thing to the next. There's no variance. Going in with the airbrush and doing something like this, it allows you enough accuracy that you know roughly where you want to lay the shadows down, but also it gives you enough randomness that it's a little bit more organic, a little bit freer, and that really helps give some variance, some visual interest and flair to a piece. Now, again, you can do this as hard or as light as that you want. I like to vary things up a little bit. So if an area particularly appeals to me, I might spend a little bit more time there. I want it to look a little bit more eye-catching, and I want the viewer to have a little bit more time there. Thinking as well about how we're going to finish this model off, we're going to have a large area of OSL. So we know from previous videos, we've talked about it a lot, is the contrast that sells that effect. So if we have darkness next to brightness, that contrast will really make it glow. And that's what I'm trying to establish here around the doorways, making that darker so that the light, the brightness, that glow really does start to pop out. Reasonably good state now, so let's tackle that roof, and we're going to use a purple. This is the same contrast color that we used on our Stormcast Eternals, the Reclusian ones. Check that video out up in the link. What you should hopefully notice here is that I'm applying the paint quite thinly from my wet palette over the top of where we'd already established some brighter points in the very initial step right back at the beginning of the video, using the airbrush and some white paint just to give it some variation in tone on these roof panels. Again, this is the forward planning, knowing that we're going to utilize the properties of the acrylic paints being semi-transparent. I certainly could have gone brighter with the laying down of the ink in the initial step, but if you do that, then you end up with too stark contrast. What I wanted it to be a little bit subtle, because this purple is very dark naturally. So giving it just a pop of light on the roof brings out a little bit of vibrancy in the color without becoming oversaturated and dominating it. We want the dominant element of this model to be that OSL, the portal effect, the glow. So having something that's detracting from that is going to be counterintuitive, counterproductive to what we want to achieve. Start stepping up a gear now. We're almost at the end of this. If you've watched the Stormcast videos, you'll see what I'm going to do next. I'm going to use a mid silver and a bright silver. And I'm also going to come in with a brown and a grey as well and use that on the basing. Now, we're going to use this all over the model, but the first thing we're going to attack is the columns and a little bit on the basing. So we want to pick out some of these textures as well. Thinking about with base, we've got a lot of varied textures down here and a lot of sharp angles that we probably want to pick out a little bit. So thinking about that, we're going to use obviously that grey and the brown on the dirt to start really picking things out. As always, I'm going to use a texture palette. I'm going to get my Stonewall grey, this nice warm grey, and the brush that I'm going to use will be slightly moist as always. Yes, I know it's dry brushing, but we've covered this many times before. Having a slight moist brush helps the paint come off of the brush in a less chalky, less dusty manner and gives you a much nicer, higher quality finish. Now, I'm using the texture palette to get rid of the paint rather than the tissue, because using the tissue is going to draw the moisture out of the brush that we've just put on with a little bit of water. Okay, straight away, let's crack on with the base then, and I'm just going to come in with basically reckless abandon. Try not to get too much of the grey on the brown, but it doesn't matter if you do. Again, it helps with that variation. Now, one of the things that you might want to think about is the direction that the light is emitting from the portal. So that's going to give us a little bit more of a heavy dry brush in the direction that the light is coming out, or roughly the direction the light is coming out. That'll help sell the OSL effect later on. Basically going to do the same thing on the portal itself. A little bit more carefully here, obviously, because we don't want to get too much of the grey, if any at all, on the metallics. Now, depending on how confident you feel, you may want to drop down the size of brush here, but I'm just going to come in with exactly the same brush, and I'm doing it quite rough, to be honest. I'm not overly concerned if there's going to be too much chalkiness at this point. I am keeping my brush mildly moist, but I do like having a more rustic look to the terrain, a little bit more worn. And picking out that stone detail really does bring the model to life. And again, thinking about where we're going to put the weight of the dry brushing around the columns near the portal is really going to help sell that blue glowing effect when we're coming in the final step to do that. Just work your way around, and there's not much to say here, is there? Just have some fun, bang on some tunes, and get through it. It won't take you too long, I promise. At this point, it's starting to look like something, well, not too bad. We've only done basic techniques, and well, it's looking pretty good already. Yes, we don't have that glow yet, but we can sort that out pretty soon. Let's get a little bit more variation in the base. Right, that brown we picked out earlier, let's crack on with that then. Get on your palette and let's basically do the same thing we did with the grey on the base. You're not just dry brushing there though, when you're stippling. And well, yeah, you're absolutely right, I am. Again, this is rule of cool. If you think that stippling on some colour in some areas is going to give you the variation that you want and is going to look cool, then you go ahead and do that. Don't let anybody tell you that you're painting wrong, because you're not. And if somebody says that to you, just walk away, because those people do not understand. There is no right or wrong way to express yourself artistically. If you enjoy it and you like how it looks, you do you. So I am indeed doing just that. I'm dry brushing in some areas, I'm stippling in others, and I'm having a pretty good time doing it, to be absolutely honest, and it looks pretty cool to my eye. Now, I'm not being overly precious about where I hit with this colour now, because we've got the variation in tone of the standard grey, then we've got the lighter grey that we dry brushed over the top, we've got some overspill from when we dry brushed with that onto the actual base foundation grey. So just hitting it with this brown over the top of the sepia that we put on after to establish those darker shadows is just really bringing it all together. It looks like dried on dust blown by the wind into the corners. If you put it on too heavy in one place or another, well, the wind was just blowing excessively hard in that direction for a little while. There's no wrong way of doing this. You can full on Bob Ross it. If you mess up, you have a nappy accident, just sell it with whatever narrative exposition you want to do. Right. Okay, work your way around the model, have some fun, enjoy your music. Let's go on to the next step. Okay, let's give the metallics a little bit more attention then. I'm going to use a very bright silver, a chrome in this case, and I'm just going to use that to pick out all of the metallic elements that we've got on the model so far. The reason I'm using silver and not gold is it just gives that point highlight. If I sell it with too much of the gold, it's going to read too bright for what I want, bearing in mind that we want it to be somewhat darker, thinking about we're going to have that glow later on. So work your way around all of the model, getting just the very edges. Now you could under highlight as well here, thinking about where the light is going to be emitting from that glow. So on the top of the arch here, you could come in from the other way around as well, which I do, just to give it a little bit of brightness there. I changed my mind on the roof section. I wasn't originally going to make the tiles metallic, but I came in with the same silver that we'd used after starting work on the top gold section, and well, I think it looks okay. I'm not 100% on it, to be absolutely honest. Perhaps I should have just left it the purple and not had a metallic element to it, but that texture was just screaming out for me for a little bit of attention. So I did that, and I think I'm happy with it. Overall, the starburst on the top, the gradient, I really like. I did come back in with some additional purple paint as well, and just clean up that center circle there, making it a little bit darker, because the coverage wasn't fantastic. It's been a while since I've used Nuln Oil, and it needs no introduction. We're going to use it on all of the grey parts of the model, all the way around the actual portal and on the base as well. This is going to give us some much needed contrast. Adding this as additional contrast to really bring out the detail of the bricks and the stonework really does start to make this pop. It also gives us that contrast that we're looking for, bringing in a darker element. And it's at this point I started to think, I'm not really happy with the model. I don't like where it's going, and I need to do something to fix it. I can't quite put my finger on it. Looking at it straight on, I'm not happy. So what I've decided to do is bring some of this gold down to the bottom of the model. And these metallic panels, they're too similar in tone to the grey. So we're going to bring the purple that we've established on the roof onto these panels, and then we're going to use the OSL effect on the lines to sell that a little bit more. That's going to give us more contrast and more balance to the entire model. It's important to understand that it is okay as well to change your mind, make changes, have additional elements that you want to paint during a project if it's not something that you're happy with. Yes, it's frustrating, but it's not the end of the world. It's better to end up with a model that you're happy with on the tabletop and something that you want to play with rather than living with regret. At the end of the day, it's only paint. It's easy to paint over. Yes, you've already gone past this step, but it's easy enough to do. And I think you'll agree with me when we get to the finished product, it does really help. And it was absolutely worth the extra little bit of effort and time that we're going to put into this just to bring it to where we want it to be. I really wasn't happy with how these panels turned out, even though I wanted to tie them together to the actual armor that we'd done on the Stormcast. It was just too similar in tone. There wasn't enough contrast there, and it was too bright overall for what we were trying to get. The purple over top of the metallics though really turned out well. There's enough variation that it's interesting. You can look at it now. I'm much happier. It's pretty much where I want it to be. It's the right value in terms of darkness and contrast. I've picked out a few additional details with gold just at the bottom, and again this ties it into the base a little bit more there. At this point then we can start to figure out the glow, and it's going to be exactly the same as what we did on the Stormcast. I'll put a link up in the corner now so you can jump back to that video. But the first thing I'm going to do is get some white ink, and I'm going to start establishing the hottest points of the model. I'm using it thinned down, and I'm just going to start tracing these white lines. If it gets a little bit too messy, jump back in with that purple, but don't worry about it too much because, well, if you've seen the other videos, you know how we do the glow. We're going to come in with the airbrush after the fact and start to give it a little bit of a diffusion in there with the same white ink. And that'll hide any small mistakes, so don't worry too much. Just make sure that your ink is as thin as possible while still giving you decent coverage, and perhaps use a better brush than I did because this was a truly atrocious brush and I really wasn't helping myself to get through this. This took a little bit of time, but it is what it is. I also did the top part of the model as well. The orb thing on top, I don't know what it's called. The video is quite long as it is, so I won't go into explicit detail on how to do the glow because I've covered it in so many videos already. But getting the white ink, I'm going to establish a diffusion over all of the white elements that we've already put in. And then I'm going to come in with a bright blue. Then it's a case of just working backwards and forwards between the blue and the white, re-establishing hotspots in smaller and smaller regions, and that is what gives you the glow. Do you want to see more videos about how to create OSL in a more subtle and realistic way? Let me know down in the comments. I'll be more than happy to put that sort of video together as well. And with that done, let's take a look. What do you reckon then? Is it portaloo? Is it not? Does it look good? Does it look bad? What do you think of the base? Do you like that idea? It works for me. I base all of my terrain. I think it's interesting to tie it into the wider game narrative that you might have going on for your own game boards. Do you base yours? Let me know down in the comments. I did want to revisit this and just get this one out of the way because, well, I think it deserved it, to be honest, and I had fun doing it. We didn't spend much time on it, but it was a good, fun project. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.